What if the happiest day of your life was stamped forbidden? That's what a black woman faced when her HOA tried to cancel her wedding on her own lawn, citing rules as cold as stone. Their voices died out when the first guest arrived, the governor himself, walking proudly to her side. Imagine this: the happiest day of your life, a day written in flowers and laughter, threatened by a letter slipped under your door. Imagine planning to marry the love of your life on the land you worked for, only to find rules sharpened into weapons, neighbors smiling by day but whispering by night. This was Danielle Carter's story, and it began not with music or joy, but with silence. Her lawn stretched wide, a patch of earth bordered by a proud white fence. To Danielle, it was more than wood and paint. It was belonging. She had worked for this house, saved for it, built her life around it. Here she would plant her garden, raise her children, and on one radiant summer afternoon, marry the man she loved. The fence was supposed to keep her safe, but fences, in the wrong hands, also divide. Neighbors walked their dogs past her yard and waved politely. Cars slowed, windows down, offering nods of courtesy. Yet beneath that politeness lingered something heavier, something unsaid. Danielle could feel it, like the hum of electricity before a storm. Smiles too thin, greetings too short, glances that slipped away too fast. What was hidden beneath the surface would soon rise, and it would rise against her. On the edge of this quiet order stood Linda Cartwright, the president of the Homeowners Association. People in the neighborhood joked that Linda ran the community like a mayor, though no one had elected her. She ruled by ordinances, by bylaws, by an endless stream of standards. To Linda, Danielle's wedding wasn't love, it was disruption. Not celebration, it was defiance. The white fence that marked Danielle's property became, in Linda's eyes, a border that should not be crossed. The first strike came not with words spoken, but with paper. One evening, Danielle found a folded letter pressed beneath her door. She opened it slowly, the kind of slow that comes when your heart already knows something heavy waits inside. The words were short, precise, stripped of warmth. Your planned event violates community standards. Fines may be assessed. You are required to cease and desist. She read it twice. 3 times. Each time the words seemed colder, as if the ink itself carried disdain. A wedding on her lawn, her own lawn, was now labeled a violation. Her fiancé tried to calm her, but Danielle's hands trembled as she held the letter. "This isn't about noise," she said softly. He asked, "Then what is it about?" Her voice steadied. "It's about me." She knew it before he did. The fence, the silence, the smiles that never reached the eyes. It had always been there. Now it had a letterhead, an HOA logo, and a signature at the bottom. The paper was more than a warning. It was a declaration of war. The next morning, Danielle walked through her neighborhood with her head high, but every step felt like a performance on a stage where the audience had already chosen sides. She waved to a neighbor trimming roses. The neighbor glanced up, smiled faintly, and went back to her shears without a word. Another man watering his lawn let the hose slip to the ground as she passed, his eyes narrowing before he turned away. The silence of one person could be dismissed as indifference, but the silence of many? That was complicity. She tried calling friends in the neighborhood, hoping to hear solidarity. Some didn't answer. Others replied with vague phrases. "I don't want to get involved. Maybe just talk to Linda. It's only one day, Danielle." Each word struck harder than the letter itself. This was her home, her dream, yet no one dared to stand beside her. At night, she sat at her kitchen table, the letter spread out under the lamp. Its words seemed to grow darker with each glance, as though the paper itself was feeding off her frustration. She imagined Linda sitting smugly behind her desk, believing that bureaucracy could erase joy. Danielle pressed her palm against the wood of her table, grounding herself. She whispered to the empty room. Not this time. But determination alone was not enough. The HOA had power, written into rules that could summon lawyers, fines, and court dates. Danielle understood the stakes. The white fence outside her window, once a symbol of safety, now glowed like a warning line in the moonlight. She knew the coming weeks would not just test her right to marry on her lawn, they would test whether silence could defeat her spirit. The introduction of injustice always begins quietly. A letter, a whisper, a smile that conceals judgment. But Danielle Carter's story was about to grow louder, much louder, because fences may mark boundaries, but they cannot contain the human will. And silence, when broken, can roar louder than any ordinance. The sun rose sharp that morning, laying a golden sheen over white fences that lined every yard. To most, they were ordinary markers of property, clean lines of order. To Danielle, they had become walls of division, boards nailed together not just by carpenters but by prejudice. What once felt protective now loomed like barriers closing in. She stepped onto her porch, coffee in hand, staring at the fence that framed her lawn. It was fresh painted, straight, proud. She had chosen the color herself, a crisp white to reflect openness. But lately, she wondered if the same fence whispered a different message to others. This is where you do not belong. Across the street, Linda stood with a clipboard, speaking to two neighbors. Their voices carried in clipped fragments, just enough for Danielle to hear. Linda said, "Rules keep peace. If we let one exception, the whole order collapses." One neighbor muttered, "It's just a wedding." Linda's reply cut like glass. "It's never just anything. It's precedent." Danielle's grip tightened on her mug. They weren't even hiding it anymore. Her wedding wasn't a disruption. It was a threat, not to peace, but to power. Later that day, Danielle walked the sidewalk, passing yards trimmed to perfection. She caught the stares. A woman watering tulips leaned toward her friend and whispered. The friend's laughter bubbled, sharp and short, dying quickly when Danielle's eyes met theirs. Another neighbor adjusted his mailbox, though it didn't need adjusting, just to avoid greeting her. The silence of a crowd was thicker than words. She remembered moving into the neighborhood 2 years earlier, full of hope. People had smiled then too. They had brought pies, introduced themselves warmly, and said how glad they were to have her join. But time revealed the truth. Those smiles had been tests, not welcomes. She was being measured against rules unspoken, standards unwritten. That evening, Danielle found her fiancé on the porch, fixing a loose hinge on the gate. She leaned against the railing, watching him work. She said, "Funny, isn't it? How a fence can mean safety to one person and exclusion to another." He looked up, sweat on his brow. "It's just wood, Danny," she shook her head. "No, it's what they see when they look at it. To them, it's not ours, it's theirs. And I'm crossing a line they drew a long time ago." A storm cloud drifted in the distance, shadowing half the street. Danielle stared at it, feeling its echo in her chest. The fence in front of her was no longer neutral. It was the first weapon in a war she had not chosen, and wars rarely start with fire. They start with lines. Lines drawn, defended, and enforced. The boardroom smelled faintly of coffee and disinfectant, the kind of sterile air that erases comfort. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a pale glare on the long table where the HOA board sat like a panel of judges. Stacks of folders lined the table, pens poised, papers neatly aligned. To anyone else, it was just another meeting. To Danielle, it felt like a trial. She walked in with her fiancé beside her, shoulders squared. Conversations hushed as neighbors filled the back rows, some curious, others eager to witness her stumble. Linda Cartwright sat at the center, clipboard in hand, glasses perched low on her nose. She tapped her pen against the table, a rhythm that echoed authority. Linda cleared her throat. "Ms. Carter, it has come to our attention that you intend to host a wedding on your property. That is against Community Ordinance Section 4B, subsection 9. Danielle's voice was steady. "It's my lawn. My property. My right," Linda leaned forward, lips curling. "Community standards apply to everyone. Exceptions create chaos. Today it's a wedding, tomorrow it's, who knows. Raves, political rallies, circus tents." A chuckle rippled through a few in the audience. Danielle's fiancé shifted in his seat, but Danielle didn't flinch. She replied, "You call it chaos. I call it family. You call it a disturbance. I call it vows." The pen in Linda's hand froze. For a brief moment, the tapping stopped. Then she smiled, thin and sharp. "Rules don't bend for feelings, Ms. Carter." Danielle met her stare. "Then maybe your records are broken." Gasps fluttered across the room, soft but undeniable. The board members glanced at one another, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Linda straightened her papers, masking the crack. The rest of the meeting dragged on, filled with procedural jargon, motion carried, point of order, bylaws enforced. But beneath every word was a current of hostility, every phrase an attempt to strip her joy into technicalities. The table might as well have been a battlefield, its wood polished smooth by countless confrontations, where ordinary lives were ruled by ordinances. When it ended, Danielle walked out into the night air, her heart racing but her resolve unbroken. The fluorescent glare was gone, replaced by stars that blinked down like silent witnesses. She knew now the fight wasn't just against Linda. It was against a system that could turn paper into shackles and pens into weapons. Her fiancé squeezed her hand. That was brutal. She exhaled slowly. It's only the first round. Behind her, through the glass doors, Linda still sat at the table, pen in hand, eyes narrowed as if planning her next strike. And Danielle knew this was far from over. The sky had been clear that morning, but by afternoon, a bruise-colored haze gathered on the horizon. Clouds rolled in heavy, the kind that threatened thunder but held back, waiting. Danielle stood on her porch watching them, the air damp and restless. The storm in the sky mirrored the one inside her neighborhood, unspoken, waiting to break. She logged into her phone, fingers hesitating above the screen. Until now, her battle with the HOA had been private, letters slipped under doors, confrontations in sterile rooms. But silence was eating her alive. Every time she walked outside, neighbors turned away. Every time she spoke, their lips tightened but no words came. Silence was its own kind of thunder, and she could no longer let it drown her. She opened Facebook, typed, and hit post. Imagine planning your wedding only to be told your love violates community standards. Imagine neighbors smiling while they help cancel the happiest day of your life. This is happening to me. The words glowed back at her, small but defiant. Within minutes, comments trickled in. Old friends from college expressed outrage. Strangers sent messages of support. Her story, once trapped behind fences, began to move outward, like wind carrying storm clouds across counties. Her fiancé leaned over her shoulder. "You sure you want this out there?" She nodded. "Their silence is power. If I stay quiet, I give it to them." That evening, Danielle walked her street. The air was heavier now, clouds swollen with rain. She passed houses where curtains shifted at her presence, where voices dropped low and died as she drew near. A child's laughter cut off when a parent pulled them indoors. The storm in the sky was nothing compared to the storm of avoidance pressing down on her. By nightfall, her post had been shared hundreds of times. A local news anchor even messaged her, asking for an interview. Danielle stared at the request, heart pounding. What began as a single act of defiance was growing, spreading like lightning forks in the dark. She stepped outside again, rain beginning to patter on the pavement. Her fence gleamed slick under the streetlight, droplets sliding down its surface. To her, it was no longer just wood and paint. It was a stage where silence performed, where neighbors chose complicity over courage. But now, beyond those fences, people were beginning to listen. Thunder cracked in the distance. Danielle whispered into the night air. "If they won't speak, I will." The storm answered back, rolling deep across the sky. The next letter came on a Tuesday morning. Folded crisp, slid into her mailbox like an ambush. Danielle pulled it out with a sinking gut, the envelope's weight heavier than its paper. She didn't need to read it to know. It was another strike. At the kitchen table, she tore it open. The words spilled out cold and mechanical. Violation notice. Unauthorized event. Fine assessed. $250. Failure to comply will result in escalation. Her fiancé rubbed his forehead. They're turning this into war. Danielle placed the letter flat on the table beside the first one. Then came another, and another, each envelope stacked neatly, forming a tower of hostility. Paper that should have carried bills, invitations, or holiday cards was now a weapon aimed at her joy. Later that week, she attended the mailboxes at the end of the street. Neighbors lingered there, retrieving envelopes, exchanging pleasantries, glancing at her without words. A man slid his letter into his pocket and muttered, "Should have just rented a hall." Another woman smirked and whispered to her companion, too low for Danielle to fully catch, but loud enough for the sting to land. By the time she reached her mailbox, 3 more envelopes waited. Each one with the HOA seal, each one another blow. She held them tightly, her hands trembling, the corners cutting into her palms. That night she spread them across her dining table. The table looked less like a home and more like a war room. Letters lined in rows, black ink marching like soldiers across white pages. Words became shackles, unauthorized, violation, penalty. Each term chipped at her dignity, telling her not just that her wedding was wrong, but that she was wrong for daring to dream it. Her fiancé's voice cracked with anger. They want to bury us under paper, drown us in rules until we can't breathe. Danielle didn't look up. She traced the ink with her fingertip, eyes burning. Then we don't drown. We rise. In that moment, she saw clearly what the HOA was doing. They didn't need to shout. They didn't need fists. They had bureaucracy. They had fine print. They had envelopes that cut deeper than knives. And yet, as the pile grew, so did her resolve. Each letter that arrived no longer weakened her. It hardened her. The battlefield was paper, but her weapon would be voice. Outside, the fence gleamed pale in the moonlight. Beyond it, silence still ruled. But on her table inside, stacked high, sat the evidence of war. And Danielle, staring at it, whispered to herself, "This is not the end. This is the beginning." The air at the mailbox station was never truly quiet. Dogs barked in the distance. Sprinklers ticked in rhythm. Children's bikes clattered on the pavement. But for Danielle, the loudest sound was silence. Silence that thickened when she arrived. She walked down the street, keys in hand, approaching the row of mailboxes that gleamed like obedient soldiers. 2 women were already there, chatting in low voices. Their laughter floated light and casual until they saw her coming. Then it shifted, quieter, sharper, edged with something they didn't want her to hear. Danielle pulled open her mailbox door. Envelopes slid out, one stamped with the familiar HOA seal. She didn't need to open it. She could already feel its weight in her chest. Behind her, one of the women whispered, "She should have known better." The other answered softly, "Rules are rules." Then a quick giggle, cut short when Danielle turned her head. Their smiles snapped back into place like masks. She walked home slowly, each step heavier than the last. The sting wasn't in their words. It was in the way they looked at her, as if her happiness were audacity, her wedding an offense. Later that week, she visited a local vendor to confirm flower arrangements. The shop owner fidgeted with her order, avoiding eye contact. Finally, the words slipped out. "I'm sorry, Ms. Carter, we can't deliver to your property." HOA reached out. "Said it'd cause problems." Danielle froze. "Problems? For flowers?" The owner's shoulders sagged. "I don't want trouble with them." "I hope you understand." One by one, calls began to come. A catering service backed out. A rental company canceled her chairs. Each conversation was framed with politeness. But each one carried the same truth. The HOA had reached into her life and pulled strings until her plans unraveled. Her fiancé found her late at night, sitting in the dark living room with the phone in her lap. "You can't keep letting them do this," he said, his voice low. She answered, her words sharp in the quiet. "This isn't just about a wedding anymore. It's about whether I belong here at all." The fence outside seemed to listen, its white boards catching the moonlight like silent witnesses. To Danielle, it no longer marked property lines. It marked the divide between those who belonged and those who didn't. Open hate she could have fought. Shouts, insults, even threats, at least they would have been honest. But this was quieter, colder, a slow drip of exclusion, an erosion of dignity. And somehow, it felt heavier than anything loud. She rose from the couch, straightened her back, and whispered to herself, "They want silence. They'll get a voice instead." Outside, the street was still, but inside her chest, a storm was gathering. The night was quiet, but Danielle's mind was restless. She sat at her dining table, the stack of HOA letters fanned out before her like a deck of cards she never chose to play. The neighborhood was silent outside, no voices, no music, no support. just the heavy hush of complicity pressing in through her windows. She opened her laptop, her fingers hovering above the keyboard. Doubt whispered to her. What if no one cares? What if speaking makes it worse? She closed her eyes, hearing again the laughter that died when she turned, the vendors canceling, the whispers by the mailbox. Silence had become a cage. She refused to stay inside it. Her hands moved. She typed, "My name is Danielle Carter. I live in a neighborhood where rules are supposed to mean fairness. But my HOA is trying to cancel my wedding on my own lawn with my own family. They say it violates community standards. What they mean is I do. This isn't just about a wedding. It's about who belongs." She hit post. At first, nothing. Just the glow of the screen, the hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock. Then, notifications. A like, a share, a comment. "This is outrageous. Stay strong." Another. "They can't do this to you." Her post began to spread. Old friends messaged her, distant cousins chimed in, strangers sent encouragement. What was once her private battle spilled beyond the white fences, carried across timelines and phones. By morning, hundreds had shared it. A local journalist reached out, asking for an interview. Danielle's fiancé read the email aloud, stunned. "They want to cover it on the evening news." Danielle's voice was steady. "Good. If they silence me here, I'll speak everywhere else." That afternoon, she walked through her neighborhood. Curtains fluttered, blinds shifted. Neighbors who once smirked now avoided her gaze entirely. They had seen her post. They knew her silence had broken, and it terrified them. Linda, standing on her porch, clutched her clipboard tighter than usual. She called out with forced composure, "You're making this into something it's not." Danielle stopped on the sidewalk, eyes sharp. "No, Linda, you made it into something it's not. I'm just telling the truth." Word traveled faster than any letter the HOA could write. What was meant to be buried under paper had become public. Danielle's story was no longer confined to one street. It was loose, alive, and growing. That evening, as the first news van parked near her driveway, Danielle stood at her fence. The silence of her neighbors pressed in again, but this time it didn't weigh her down. She smiled faintly, whispering to herself, "Let them stay quiet. The world is speaking now." By the time the local news aired her story, Danielle's face was no longer just another neighbor's. It was on television screens across the county. Her voice replayed in living rooms and offices. Cameras had filmed her standing in front of her fence, speaking not with bitterness, but with fire. "I'm not asking for permission to marry. I'm demanding the right to live free in my own home." The next morning, whispers spread through the neighborhood, not just at the mailboxes, but in kitchens and across porches. Some neighbors muttered that she had embarrassed the community. Others quietly admitted for the first time that maybe she had a point. Silence was cracking, and through those cracks leaked something dangerous for Linda. Sympathy. The HOA called another emergency meeting. Danielle walked in this time not as a lone figure, but as a woman watched by cameras, her words ready to echo far beyond the fluorescent walls. The board sat stiff at the table, Linda's pen already tapping, her lips drawn tight. Linda began with rehearsed authority. "Ms. Carter, your recent media activity has brought unnecessary attention to this community. We request that you remove your post and cancel the event to preserve peace." Danielle didn't sit. She stood tall at the center of the room, her eyes sweeping over the neighbors gathered in the back. "Peace? You mean silence?" "You mean my silence. You can cancel paper, you can cancel contracts, but you will not cancel me." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The cameras recorded every flicker of discomfort, every glance that darted between board members. Linda's voice sharpened. "This board enforces rules. It is not swayed by theatrics." Danielle stepped closer, her words cutting clean. "Rules built on prejudice are nothing but theater." "And your silence," she gestured toward the room, "is the applause that keeps the show alive." The pen in Linda's hand cracked mid-tap, a jagged break that echoed louder than her words. Gasps followed. The room shifted, subtle but undeniable. For the first time, authority looked brittle. Neighbors who had avoided eye contact for weeks now leaned forward, some whispering support under their breath. The board's power, once unshakable, trembled under the weight of public opinion. When Danielle left that night, the cameras followed her, lights glowing against the darkness. Her fiancé whispered, "You shook them." She nodded, eyes fixed on the storm clouds rolling overhead. Not enough yet, but the mask is cracking. Behind her, Linda stood frozen at the table, broken pen in hand, staring at the crowd that no longer looked entirely hers. The storm had broken, not in the sky but in the courtroom of public opinion. The morning of the wedding broke with a sky heavy and uncertain. The sun strained through gray clouds, spilling muted light over Danielle's lawn. White chairs stood in neat rows, draped with ribbons that fluttered in a nervous breeze. Flowers lined the aisle, their colors defiant against the dull sky, as if daring the day to be stolen. Danielle stood at her window, veil resting on her shoulders, her hands pressed together to still their trembling. For weeks she had fought for this moment, endured letters, fines, whispers, and shame. Yet now, as the day arrived, her heart pounded with both triumph and dread. Her fiancé adjusted his tie in the mirror, glancing toward her. "You ready?" Danielle's voice was soft but firm. "I've been ready." They're the ones who aren't. Outside, neighbors peeked from behind curtains. Some lingered on porches, pretending to sweep or water plants while watching the preparations unfold. Their silence carried into the air, thicker than the clouds overhead. It was not the silence of ignorance anymore. It was anticipation, waiting to see if joy would survive the rules that had tried to bury it. Down the street, a car slowed, then stopped. Another followed. Guests arrived carrying gifts, smiles, and nerves. They glanced at the fence, at the houses, at the eyes watching from behind glass. Whispers began even among them. Would the HOA really try something today? The first drops of rain tapped the fence, soft at first, then steady. Danielle stepped outside with her bridesmaids, her gown trailing behind her. The fence that once symbolized exclusion was now wrapped in garlands, flowers spilling over its top. She touched it lightly as she passed, whispering to herself, "You tried to cage me, but today you hold my vows." Guests took their seats, umbrellas opening against the drizzle. The pastor stood ready at the front, Bible in hand. Music played softly from speakers, a love song barely audible over the rising rain. Then the first shadow moved. At the far end of the street, figures approached. Linda Cartwright and several HOA board members, umbrellas in hand, papers clutched tightly in folders. Their pace was slow but deliberate, each step like a gavel strike. Neighbors whispered. Children pressed closer to their parents. Danielle's maid of honor leaned close. "They're really doing this." Linda's voice cut across the lawn, calm but sharp. "Ms. Carter, this gathering is unauthorized. You're in direct violation of community standards." The music faltered, stopping mid-note. Guests turned in their seats, some gasping, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The drizzle became heavier, pattering against plastic chairs. Danielle stood tall at the aisle's entrance. Veil pushed back, eyes locked on Linda. For a moment, the world seemed to still, the guests frozen, the neighbors hushed. The storm waiting to break. Her fiancé stepped beside her, jaw tight. "This is our day," he whispered. Danielle nodded, never breaking her gaze from Linda. The silence around them pressed like a wall. The HOA's shadow stood at the gate, paper weapons raised. Her joy stood dressed in white, unyielding. The first battle of the climax had begun, not with shouts, not with chaos, but with silence so thick it dared someone to break it. And Danielle, standing at the threshold of her vows, whispered to herself, "Let them try." The rain thickened, dripping from the edges of umbrellas, streaking the petals laid across the aisle. Guests shifted uneasily in their seats, eyes darting between Danielle in her gown and the advancing figures of the HOA board. The lawn, dressed for joy, felt like a battlefield waiting for the first blow. Linda Cartwright stopped at the gate, her umbrella tilted like a shield. In her hand was a manila folder, edges warped from the damp air. Her voice carried across the rows of chairs, sharp enough to slice through the drizzle. "Ms. Carter," she declared, "you are in direct violation of Ordinance Section 4, Subsection 9. This event is hereby declared unauthorized. If you proceed, you will face escalating fines, legal action, and possible injunction. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A bridesmaid muttered, "Unbelievable." A groomsman whispered under his breath, "On her wedding day." Danielle took a slow breath. She felt the weight of the veil against her shoulders, the eyes of her guests, the silence of her neighbors. And then she stepped forward, down the aisle, her gown brushing against damp grass. She stopped at the fence line, just feet from Linda. Danielle's voice was calm, but it carried. "You think you can cancel love with paperwork?" Linda's eyes narrowed. "This is about order. Rules don't bend for anyone." Danielle tilted her head, the rain catching in her curls. "Then maybe they're not rules. Maybe they're chains." "And chains break," the crowd stirred, whispers turning into murmurs of agreement. A guest clapped once, sharply, before stopping as if unsure if applause was allowed here. Linda slammed her folder shut. "We will not tolerate chaos in this community." Danielle's fiancé joined her side, his voice low but fierce. "You call a wedding chaos? What does that make you, standing here with threats while she's in a wedding gown?" The board members behind Linda shifted, uncertainty flickering across their faces. One of them whispered something, but Linda silenced him with a glare. Danielle lifted her chin, her words ringing louder than the thunder overhead. "This is my lawn. This is my vow. You can fine me, you can threaten me, but you will not silence me. Not today." For a heartbeat, the entire lawn seemed suspended. The guests, the neighbors, even the board, all waiting to see if her words would bend or break. Linda took a step closer, her shoes sinking into the wet grass.
"You're making a mistake, Miss Carter. This will not end well for you." Danielle's reply was sharp, almost a whisper, but cutting through the rain like glass.
"The only mistake here is believing paper is stronger than people." The crowd reacted, first with gasps, then with scattered applause. Neighbors at their windows leaned closer, pressed against glass, witnessing a confrontation they had tried to avoid for weeks. Silence, once their weapon, was slipping away. Linda's hand trembled as she reached for her pen. She opened the folder, pulling out a document meant to halt the ceremony. But her voice cracked on the first word, rain smudging the ink. The paper, meant to silence Vows, looked fragile against the defiance in Danielle's eyes. The pastor, who had stood frozen at the altar, finally spoke, his voice steady. "This is a wedding, not a courtroom. We will proceed unless stopped by a higher authority than bylaws." The guests erupted in applause this time, louder, firmer. Linda's face stiffened, but her authority no longer seemed absolute. Danielle's courage had shifted the air. Her fiancé leaned toward her, whispering with a smile. "You just won the first round." Danielle glanced at Linda, rain dripping from her lashes, and said softly but clearly, "This vow won't wait." The thunder rolled in agreement, echoing over the neighborhood. The wedding was not canceled. It had only just begun. The rain eased to a drizzle, as though the storm itself were pausing to see what would unfold. Danielle stood at the fence, her gown damp at the hem, her defiance shining brighter than the gray sky. Linda clutched her folder like a weapon that had already failed her, the board members shifting uneasily at her side. The crowd murmured, tension thick as fog. Then the hum of an engine cut through the air. A black sedan rolled slowly down the street, its windows dark, tires hissing against wet pavement. Conversation stopped. Guests turned in their seats. Even the neighbors behind curtains leaned forward, unable to look away. The car came to a stop at the curb. For a moment, no one moved. Then the rear door opened, and a polished black shoe stepped onto the asphalt. Gasps broke like waves as the governor of the state emerged, umbrella in hand, suit pressed sharp despite the drizzle. Whispers surged. "Is that? It can't be. Why is he here?" Linda's face paled, her lips parting in disbelief. She stammered, her pen trembling in her hand. "Governor?" The governor walked calmly toward the lawn, the crowd parting as though by instinct. He shook Danielle's hand warmly, his voice carrying without effort. "I wouldn't miss this. You've got a wedding to celebrate." The silence that followed was explosive. Neighbors gasped, guests erupted into cheers, and for the first time in weeks, Danielle felt the tide shift visibly in her favor. Linda tried to recover, stepping forward with her folder. "Governor, with all due respect, this event violates community standards. He cut her off with a glance sharp enough to slice. Community standards? I see families. I see love. I see a citizen exercising her right to live freely in her own home. What exactly is the problem here? The board members froze, exchanging nervous glances. Linda's composure cracked. Her voice faltered. The ordinance clearly states. Danielle's words sliced through hers. Ordinances don't trump dignity, the governor nodded firmly. She's right. And unless you've forgotten, ordinances also don't trump state law. This wedding is happening. Gasps turned into applause, louder this time, rolling across the lawn like thunder. Neighbors at their windows opened them wider, some even stepping onto porches, clapping hesitantly at first, then with conviction. The silence that once weighed heavy was gone, broken, shattered into sound. Linda's pen slipped from her hand, snapping against the wet grass. The sound was small but symbolic. Authority, once absolute, had cracked in her grip. She bent to retrieve it, but her fingers shook. Danielle looked at her squarely. You tried to cancel love with paper, but you can't cancel truth with ink. The governor turned toward the pastor, his voice resolute. Shall we get on with it? The pastor smiled, lifting his Bible high. We shall. The guests rose to their feet, clapping and cheering, umbrellas swaying in unison. The lawn that had been tense with silence now pulsed with sound, joy, and defiance. Linda staggered back a step, her authority bleeding away with every cheer. She whispered under her breath, barely audible. This isn't over, but it was. At least for her. The balance of power had shifted. The arrival of one man had cracked the silence of many, and the crowd was no longer hers to command. Danielle squeezed her fiancé's hand, eyes glistening. We won't just marry today. We'll make history. The governor smiled, steady and unflinching. Then let's make sure everyone's watching. The cheers still echoed as Danielle walked back toward the altar, her hand tightly holding her fiancé's. The governor remained by her side, his very presence a shield stronger than any ordinance. Guests reclaimed their seats, umbrellas trembling with excitement, the lawn vibrating with new energy. What had started as a battlefield now felt like sacred ground. But at the edge of the lawn, Linda Cartwright stood frozen. The broken pen lay damp in her palm, its ink smeared across her fingers. For years, she had ruled this community with clipped words and paper threats. Now, in the space of a single morning, her voice carried no weight. She tried one last time. This is outrageous, she hissed. But her words fell into the air like stones into water, sinking, disappearing without ripple. No one looked at her, not even the board members at her side. The neighbors who had once whispered behind closed doors began to shift. One by one, they stepped outside. A woman crossed her arms, then slowly began to clap. A man leaned against his porch railing and shouted, "Let them marry!" Applause spread, hesitant at first, then steady, until the sound swelled like a wave. Linda's face flushed, her composure unraveling. She barked at the crowd. Do you all forget the rules? The fines? But her words were drowned out by the growing chorus of support. The silence she once weaponized had turned against her. It was no longer compliance. It was rejection. Danielle stood tall at the altar now, her gown damp but radiant. She turned her head slightly toward Linda, her voice steady enough to cut through the noise. You tried to break me with silence. Now listen to the sound of it breaking you. The governor gave a small nod, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. Order built on fear never lasts. Order built on justice endures. The pastor raised his hand, calling the guests back into focus. The ceremony began, words of love spoken over the same ground that had been marked as forbidden. Every vow became a declaration not just of love but of defiance. Linda's knees wobbled as she stepped back, retreating from the gate. Her clipboard slipped from her arm, papers scattering across the wet grass like white flags of surrender. She crouched to collect them, but the wind carried some away, plastering them against the fence and the shoes of guests who didn't bother to pick them up. The board members lingered awkwardly before edging away, unwilling to stand beside a leader whose power had dissolved. Their silence now betrayed her, not Danielle. As Danielle and her fiancé exchanged vows, the applause thundered again, neighbors joining in without hesitation. Children clapped from porches, elders waved from windows, and the community that once hid behind silence now leaned into sound. Linda stood at the far corner of the street, soaked, papers sagging in her hands. Her lips moved, but no one cared to listen. For the first time, she was invisible in the very neighborhood she once controlled. The pastor's voice rang out, clear and strong. "By the authority vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife." The crowd erupted. Cheers, whistles, applause that rose above the storm. The rain broke fully then, pouring down in sheets, but no one moved to leave. They stayed, laughing, crying, drenched together in the storm, as if nature itself wanted to wash the street clean. Danielle kissed her husband beneath the rain. The fence behind them strung with flowers dripping water like tears of release. She whispered in his ear, "They tried to silence us. Now listen, they never can." And all around her, the sound of a community no longer obeying injustice rose like a hymn. The storm passed as quickly as it had come, leaving the air washed clean, the sky opening into patches of pale blue. The rain still clung to the petals on Danielle's flowers, jeweled drops sparkling in the afternoon light. Her lawn, once threatened, once deemed a violation, now stood transformed into something holy. Guests lingered in their seats, damp but radiant with joy. Children splashed in puddles along the fence line, laughter cutting through the air where silence had once ruled. The fence itself, decorated with garlands and dripping blossoms, seemed to have shed its old meaning. What had been a barrier now framed the altar of Danielle's victory. The music began again, no longer tentative. A violin struck its first note, bold and unafraid, joined by the hum of voices rising in song. Danielle and her husband walked down the aisle hand in hand, their smiles carrying the weight of survival and defiance. Each step across the wet grass was a declaration. Love had not just survived, it had triumphed. Neighbors who once avoided her gaze now clapped openly. Some even approached, hesitant at first, but offering handshakes, hugs, apologies unspoken, but understood in their gestures. The community, fractured for weeks, was beginning to stitch itself back together under the sound of vows and music. Danielle paused at the fence, resting her hand against its damp wood. She whispered quietly, not to anyone in particular. "You tried to be a wall. Today, you became a frame." The governor, watching nearby, nodded with quiet satisfaction. He had seen protests, battles, campaigns, but rarely had he seen such a symbolic victory bloom in such an ordinary place. "This," he said softly to those near him, "is how communities are reborn." As the reception began, tables set beneath the clearing sky, the atmosphere turned from tense to celebratory. Laughter replaced whispers. Music replaced silence. The lawn, once written off by ordinances, now pulsed with life, its memory forever changed. Danielle looked across the crowd, the friends who stayed, the family who traveled, the neighbors who finally chose courage, and felt a peace she had almost forgotten. Her voice broke gently as she whispered to her new husband, "They wanted this place to be the end of me. Instead, it's the beginning of us." And as the first dance began under strings of lights and the fading sunset, her lawn was no longer just property. It was consecrated ground, a living altar to the power of standing unbroken. The morning after the wedding, the neighborhood was quiet in a different way. Not the heavy, complicit silence of weeks before, but a hushed calm that follows a storm. Lawns glistened with dew, chairs had been cleared, and Danielle's flowers still clung to the fence, their colors stubborn against the pale light. The echoes of music and vows lingered in the air like perfume. At the HOA office, a small brick building near the entrance of the subdivision, Linda Cartwright sat at her desk. Her pen, once her weapon, now shook in her hand. Paperwork lay scattered before her. Not letters of fines or notices of violation, but a single sheet with her name typed neatly at the top, resignation letter. Her reflection in the office window looked older than she remembered. The sharpness that once made neighbors obey now seemed brittle, hollowed by the weight of failure. She tried to steady her breathing, tried to summon the authority she had wielded for so long. But all she could hear was the sound of applause from the day before, echoing in her ears like a verdict. When she finally signed her name, The pen scratched weakly across the paper. The motion that had once carried confidence now trembled with shame. This was not resignation by choice, it was resignation by defeat. Word spread quickly. By noon, neighbors gathered in small knots along the street, talking in voices laced with both relief and disbelief. A board member confirmed what many suspected. Linda had stepped down. No meeting, no speech, just a letter slid across a desk. Authority surrendered with a shaky signature. Danielle heard the news while clearing decorations from her lawn. A neighbor she barely knew approached with hesitant steps. "It's true," he said quietly. "She resigned this morning." Danielle paused, her hand resting on a bundle of flowers. For a moment, she didn't speak. Then she exhaled slowly. She wrote her final notice, and this time it wasn't for me. Her husband joined her side, smiling faintly. Justice doesn't always wear robes or sit in courtrooms. Sometimes it's just a signature. Across the street, the fence gleamed in the midday sun. The same fence that had once marked division now bore the remnants of ribbons, fluttering in the breeze like banners of triumph. For Danielle, it wasn't just Linda who had resigned. It was the authority of silence, the grip of fear that had ruled her community. Linda's power ended not with shouts or confrontation, but with shame inked onto paper. And that was the quietest, and perhaps the loudest, defeat of all. Within days, Danielle's story spread far beyond her neighborhood. The local news segment was picked up by larger outlets, headlines flashing across morning shows and online articles. Bride defies HOA, governor attends wedding in support. What had begun as whispers at mailboxes now ran as lead stories across state lines. Reporters called non-stop. Interviews filled Danielle's evenings. Photos of her standing in her gown, rain dripping from her veil as she stared down Linda's clipboard, circulated on social media with captions like, "This is courage," and "Love over rules." Memes sprouted, one showing Linda's broken pen against Danielle's vows, another turning the phrase "unauthorized event" into a badge of defiance. But behind the noise, something deeper stirred. People from other communities reached out, sharing their own battles with HOAs, city ordinances, and silent prejudice hidden under bureaucratic language. Emails poured in. "You gave me hope." "They tried to silence me too. Your fight reminded me that joy can be resistance." Danielle sat at her kitchen table reading these messages, the same table once buried in letters of violation. Now, instead of demands and fines, it held testimonies of solidarity. The paper war had ended, and in its place grew a movement. Her husband leaned over her shoulder, smiling as he read one email aloud. "She says she's naming her daughter after you, because you showed her what it means to stand tall." Danielle pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed. "It was just a wedding," she whispered. He shook his head. "No, it was never just a wedding. It was a stand." Across the nation, commentators debated what her story meant. Some called it a fight against prejudice. Others framed it as resistance to overreaching authority. A few simply celebrated it as a love story that refused to be erased. But in every telling, one thing was clear. Danielle's wedding had become more than vows under a storm. It had become a mirror, forcing communities to ask themselves, who do we silence? Who do we exclude, and why? Back in her neighborhood, life returned to its routines. Lawns mowed, sprinklers ticking, children riding bikes. But the air had changed. People waved more openly now, greetings less forced, less guarded. Silence, once their refuge, was broken. And Danielle, walking past the fence still wrapped in flowers, knew her story had escaped these streets. What had started here had traveled across states, across minds, across hearts. Her lawn was just the beginning. The neighborhood looked different now, though the houses hadn't moved and the fences still gleamed white in the sun. What had shifted was something harder to see. The weight of silence was gone. Where whispers once lived, voices had returned. Where fear had ruled, courage had taken root. Danielle walked her lawn barefoot one evening, the grass cool beneath her steps, her gown replaced by simple clothes, yet the feeling no less sacred. The flowers still clung to the fence, though some had wilted. She traced the wood with her fingertips, remembering every moment it had stood as a boundary meant to keep her out of her own belonging. Now it was different. The fence wasn't a wall anymore. It was a frame, holding the memory of vows spoken in defiance of silence. Her husband joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "Feels different, doesn't it?" She nodded. "It's not just ours anymore. It belongs to everyone who ever thought they couldn't stand up." The governor's words replayed in her mind. Order built on fear never lasts. Order built on justice endures. He was right. Her story had outgrown her street, her wedding, even her fight with the HOA. It had become something larger, a reminder that injustice can wear many masks, sometimes as neighbors, sometimes as rules. But silence is always its accomplice. She thought of the neighbors who had once turned away, now stopping to wave. She thought of the strangers who had written to her, saying her courage gave them theirs. She thought of Linda, her resignation penned in shaky lines. A reminder that power can collapse quietly, without drama, when truth finally outweighs fear. As the sun dipped low, Danielle whispered to herself, "This wasn't just a vow to him. It was a vow to me, to never be silent again." And maybe that was the true wedding vow, the one not written in programs or spoken before pastors, but carved into the heart of anyone who refuses to be erased. The world will remember her wedding not just for the rain, the broken pen, or the governor's arrival, but for what it represented, that love, when defended, becomes justice. That silence, when broken, becomes history. So the question lingers, carried beyond her fence into every street and home. What would you do if your neighbors tried to silence your joy? Drop your thoughts below.